I've just finished reading Bob Woodward's book, Fear, on Trump. And be very afraid, because one of the striking characteristics of that book, which has primary relevance for this morning, is just the sheer lack of basic understanding in the President of the United States about basic trade theory and openness and the benefit that brings. It's quite astonishing. The number of Oval Office meetings where the National Security Advisor, the Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, the Treasury Secretary, everybody they can get in the room to try and persuade the President that David Ricardo was right. Now, this is a real challenge because the President clearly doesn't read briefing papers, goes with his gut, and unfortunately, of course, comparative advantage is one of those really difficult things to understand if you're not an economist. In fact, it's quite difficult for quite a lot of economists to understand as well. But it's there, it's been there for the last 200 years, and yet it is still relatively little understood. Unfortunately, the person on planet Earth who understands it least of all resides on Pennsylvania Avenue, and we have a problem as a result. So Woodward's book, there were just too many quotes from too many people in too many meetings for it not to be smoke without fire. So I think there was something very disturbing there. And what does it mean for today? It means that the global index here on economic openness is really, really important at this time. It is very, very important that we do make sure that we can minimize the effects of Trumpian protectionism. I like his tax cuts, I like his deregulation, I love his stuff about climate change. I'm a realist. But what I don't like is the implications of where he's going with regard to trade policy. It is really quite a profound shift. Yes, even Reagan dallied with a little bit of protectionism, and George Bush did as well, because he promised in the election campaign that he would help steel manufacturers and producers, and he did. But these are relatively small beer compared with what's now occurring. Thankfully, it's not too bad yet. If you look at the latest World Trade Organization projections, then World Trade Growth is projected to slow to just under 4% this year, compared with, they thought, 4.5% before that. Actually, that is still faster growth than we've had over the 2015-16 period. So trade is slowing, but actually it's still faster than it was only a few years ago. And so it's not too bad yet. IMF last week did some simulations, and, can you believe the models? No, you can't, but they give you rough orders of magnitude. And they're only looking at different scenarios and it kind of escalates from current tariffs and what's been announced so far and retaliatory measures, and that doesn't do much. It's 0.1, 0.2% of kind of the overall growth rate, which is not big. But the deeper and the wider you go with those tariffs, protectionist and non-tariff barrier measures, then of course the greater the problem becomes. And up to about 1% of global GDP, according to the IMF. Now, I'm not signing up to those numbers, there's an order of magnitudes, but it does say there will be consequences. You don't play around with these institutional factors without there being consequences. There's also another aspect to openness which makes the index very, very, very relevant at the present time, and that is the whole Brexit debate. I mean, there are two holy grails of Brexit in the UK at the present time. The holy grail of the Treasury on Whitehall is zero tariffs on UK exports to the EU. That is the progress. That's what was the measure and the marker and the benchmark of success. Could we retain zero tariffs on our exports to the EU post-Brexit? But from a classical economic perspective, from a Ricardian perspective, it's something very different. The holy grail there is not zero tariffs on exports, it's zero tariffs on imports from the whole world, because that has static and dynamic effects. The static effect is you get the benefit of lower world prices. So People benefit from not having to pay so much as they are now because of the EU protectionist tariff wall. And you get the dynamic effect from greater competition and the greater spread of throughout the economy of ideas and productivity improvements from overseas. Think about, David, think about the UK car industry in the 1980s. You know, slightly different, but it illustrates the point. Removal of subsidies, removal of protection there has led to the flowering of the car industry over the last 20 years. That's the sort of dynamic effect you get from greater openness. But that is counterintuitive, isn't it? Because you're actually saying remove protectionist measures and you're better off and you're stronger. Whereas, of course, the language itself, the very language itself, suggests the contrary. And so it is a very difficult thing to sell. Just as it's difficult for the President of the United States to understand, it is different for the average person in the street to understand, and understandably so. But the benefits are there. Think of the abolition of the Corn Laws in the 19th century. That led to the flowering of the middle class, ultimately, because it opened up a whole new set of goods and services which were available to them, because they had to spend less money on food, and they could have. So everything else flowed from that. And so it is so important, openness. It is so important. And that's why this is the worst moment in history, really, if you think about it, for us to engage in Trumpian protectionism. One, because there's a legacy of the financial crisis still, and there's a debt threat out there, whether it is in China, Wall Street, or the resumption of the euro crisis. The world economy is not out of the mire yet. It's not got escape velocity yet, and so there is a real consequence there, and there's a risk as a result of that, that if there was an economic downturn, that this whole shift towards protectionism could veer even more in that direction, and you move towards kind of 1930s scenario. We're not there yet, thankfully, but there is a risk in the rhetoric and the reality, and if there was an economic downturn in the near future, and let's face it, we'll actually do one. It's 10 years since an economic downturn, and you know, they do come round again. Let's hope it's not a serious one. But it's also, I think, a challenge because this is the first time in history where the world is moving towards being one world economy. Now, I don't mean that in some sort of EU utopian single economy and institutional sense. I mean because of the impact of the digital world and the fact that buyers and sellers, savers and investors, people and ideas are being brought together in a way that's never been achieved before. That has huge potential benefits. That has huge potential for overcoming secular stagnation and triggering an inflection point in productivity growth, which is the complete, that's non-conventional wisdom. I know what the received wisdom is the opposite, but I've always been a bit countercultural. So that is a huge potential there, which we surely don't want to miss. And I'll just finish with one comment, really. I'm writing a book at the moment called The Race, and it's all about how the defining feature of the 2020s will be a race to get the amazing potential of technology before the awesome challenges of demography kick in. And that, the key factor that will determine success or failure there, will be the degree of economic freedom countries enjoy. Less tax and spends, less of the regulatory state. That is going to be much more important in the 21st century than the 20th century. If you want to know why, you'll have to buy the book, and it's not out yet, but you'll check. But that is going to be much more important. And it's also not just at the domestic level that freedom and openness will be much more important in terms of tax and spend and regulation. It's at the international level as well, where it is absolutely going to be crucial as well. But in both cases, the digital new economy will flourish best when it's got economic freedom. And that's why the 2020s is going to be, there's going to be a great divergence, in my view, between those economies which are free and open and have relatively good demographics, and therefore are going to maximize the technology effects, and the others who are on demographic death row, interventionist, highly statist, and there's going to be a widening divide there. And we should just think about how this comes about and how important it is, what Hernando was talking about. If you think of prosperity, what are the determinants of prosperity? If you think of a river with it running from upstream to downstream. It's got the tributaries up at the top there. which kind of shape individual perspectives on culture and worldviews. When you aggregate those individual worldviews, they may be secularist, they may be religious, whatever, that aggregates to culture, what we call culture. Culture will then help shape institutions. Institutions in economics are the rules of the game, property rights, tax, regulation, all these institutional factors. And those institutional factors help shape actually ultimate performance. Ultimate performance in terms of productivity and output and competitiveness is quite a long way down. What you need is to get it right at the top and halfway down. And I think this is one of the great tasks and the great objective of this global index, to try and quantify some of these mechanisms so we can understand a little bit more about what ultimately drives prosperity. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, as they say, two extremely hard acts to follow. I was very taken by Mr. De Soto's point about macroeconomics versus what happens on the ground. And when I looked at the report, I first of all looked at it very carefully and thought, gosh, this is complicated, isn't it? Well, I'm not an economist. I used to be in government. I was a diplomat. I've worked on trade and investment promotion and all sorts of things like that. I'm currently working for a very large business group. The Tata Group's a $100 billion business in over 100 countries around the world. And before too long, I shall be working with a couple of small businesses. And it struck me that there's a lot of different angles at which you can approach the big questions that are in this report. And it's not that one of them is right and the others are wrong, but somehow we need to look at these questions from both the macro and the micro point of view. If you're an economist, you tend to think about things in aggregate and in the long run. If you're running a business, even a long-term kind of a business, and Tata's been going for 150 years, and a lot of our equity is in our charitable trusts, so we can afford to be quite long-term, but you won't be there in the long term if you don't run your business in the short term. And so the quarterly numbers still matter, and you've actually got to think about how you're getting things done day to day. And it struck me certainly over the last few months and almost years now, the Brexit debate in the UK, but also the discussions now on trade more widely, that you can have a perfectly good macro discussion which doesn't actually touch too much on the practicalities of how do we get our components from one place to another, how do we sell our goods in this market or that market. So you've got to look at it from the top-down point of view as well as from the bottom-up point of view. And when I was in government, of course we were obsessed, I was in the British government, so we were obsessed with how many British exports we could help and how many foreign companies we could attract into the UK. We weren't at all keen on helping anyone import anything into the country, and in those days we weren't interested very much in helping British companies invest overseas. Now that second point has happily changed with Liam Fox at the Department of International Trade, who sees the benefits for UK PLC in promoting outward investment as well as inward investment. But there are some countries around the world, Netherlands comes to mind, where the government organisations promote trade, so they'll help imports as well as exports. Sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? But if you're an inward investor like a Tata who wants to operate in a country like the Netherlands, well, it's good to know someone's going to help you source the parts that you need to do the business you want to do. Then you might well go to the Netherlands to do it. So again, it's kind of top-down and bottom-up. Understanding where business is going to operate is an important part of this. So coming on to the question of openness and how a business might approach this. I think it's at some level it's a very simple question. Of course, the answer may not be simple, but the question is very simple. You look at a country, and my colleagues in India will be looking at the UK right now and asking themselves once again afresh the question, what kind of a country is this? And openness is clearly a very important part of that. There are different ways of answering the question. I mean, in the case of the UK government, we have an industrial strategy. But I'd say it's not really a strategy, because a strategy is where you identify priorities and do trade-offs. This is a bit more of an action plan. It's a rather long document to be a strategy. I don't think that's quite. If one presented something as long as the industrial strategy to any board I've got anything to do with, I think they'd throw it and you out and say go back and do it again properly. It's not a strategy in that sense. But the approach to openness in the report we have before us, I think, is a very important one, because you can look at it both bottom up and top down at the same time. You don't have to conclude from it that massive world level interventions are necessary. You can look at the individual indicators and see what tweaks are needed here and there to improve openness. And of course, openness is a very broad concept. When I think about it, and I do in terms again of what kind of a country the UK is, I might well look at openness to people, to IP and IP protection, research and development. How open is the country to foreign investment? Just how much does the country want foreign investment? And is that the same across sectors? And there's also a personal dimension to this, and I think we perhaps, it doesn't fit into economic studies perhaps so well, but we do need to remember, how open does a country feel to the people taking the decisions about the investment? Because ultimately, people, and we're hearing at the moment, I don't know, we'll see in time, but who wants to move to Frankfurt? The schools and the nightlife isn't as good. These things matter in the real, in the real world. These things matter. It's the people taking the decisions who are going to take the decisions. So I think in terms of openness, we also need to think about flow as well as stock, because what's the trend? What's the commitment to free trade? We can do a cross-section of where a country like the UK is right now, but is it moving in one direction or the other from where it is now? Does the country as a whole, do the people who take the decisions and influence them want more freedom or less freedom? Do they want more free trade, less free trade, more regulation, more protection, or less? So you've got to look at it very dynamically. And of course, that's not at all easy. I mean, take environmental protection, can be a thoroughly bad thing if it's disguising economic protection. It might be a good thing for other reasons, and it might indeed encourage all sorts of new business. So just a couple of specific thoughts on the report, if I may. I think that the line about the willingness to trade is directly proportional to the ability to engage in trade with as little hindrance as possible, invites the question, what kind of trade are we doing these days? Can you really define hindrance to trade simply when a lot of trade some trade is in goods, some trade is in services, and as we're seeing in the Brexit debate at the moment, goods and services are often tied up very closely together, so freedom in one kind of requires a certain amount of freedom in the other. And I very much agree about trade helping to communicate new ideas, and through competition ensure that even when a business doesn't export, it has to respond to those new ideas. And I think we saw that very much in India in the 1990s, when the then Indian government opened up the Indian economy to a significant measure of foreign competition. Some foreign companies came in. Indian business certainly had to react to that, and Indian corporates like Tata were encouraged by that themselves to start moving abroad, with a presence initially in this country and in the US. And that itself has brought huge benefits back into the Indian economy by the exchange of ideas and people and so on. On communications, there's a certain number of graphs measuring the number of fixed and mobile communications, and I just wondered whether that's still the right sort of an indicator in 2018, or is it a proxy for something else? Isn't it really about just the speed of communication and the spread of communication? And if you're a farmer operating in Western England or something, you may feel rather disadvantaged because you don't have your broadband and you can't take advantage of the Internet of Things and so on. So it's speed and spread, whether it's the number of fixed lines or not, I do slightly wonder. And I don't know how many people commuted a long distance in this morning. I didn't, I'm glad to say. But again, the indicators for transport in a large city, and I know our large city is bad enough, but there are plenty of large cities around the world which are far worse for getting around, isn't it? And I wrote down a word which I won't use, but the sheer annoyance factor of getting around a large city, isn't that quite can't it be quite a discouragement for trade and for investment? So I think there are a whole range of the micro points which dull people like me working in business think about, which we somehow need to dovetail with the macro analysis of who's where openness comes from. So I think I'll leave it there. My key thought really is there are lots of ways of cutting this cake. You can look in from 30,000 feet, you can look up from the bottom, but somehow we need to bring the two together. This report's an excellent way of making us think about that. Thank you.
I think we need to pursue one key point that David raised here, which he's clearly an expert on. Do you want to talk about nightclubs in Frankfurt? Because you clearly have that expertise.
I think we've got a tea break for that.
So, good morning. So I'm going to jump from David's micro right back up to the macro level. As you were speaking, Graeme, I'm afraid I can't disagree with your analysis or Bob Woodward's analysis of the current state of US trade policy. But I think that this offers a really great opportunity for the United Kingdom in the coming years to pick up a mantle that the US really has been the guardian of over the last few decades of expanding trade in the developing world. And I'm speaking here specifically about the African continent and not so much about Latin America, the Caribbean, or South Asia. We have a number of opportunities, I would say 3, really ahead of us. The first obvious one really is to immediately roll over the EU's existing preferential trade agreements, and I believe that this is the intention of the British government. And that's sort of a no-brainer, as it were. We also have the opportunity to improve upon those existing agreements. The Everything But Arms Agreement, the EBA, isn't nearly as generous as its American counterpart, AGOA, when it comes to rules of origin, particularly for textiles products. That's something that we could improve in the immediate term. But ultimately, these agreements are now 15, almost 20 years old, and like anything else, they've begun to show their age. Ultimately, we need to be working towards new agreements and new types of agreements, moving away from preferential agreements, which can and are cut off at the knees when a country begins to do too well, towards permanent normalized trading agreements. And very helpfully, this is something where we already actually have pretty good models. NAFTA, for example, was really the first of its kind to set up permanent normalized trade relations between 2 very wealthy advanced economies and at that point fairly poor economy in the global south, Mexico. That was a leap of faith by the Mexicans. It meant abandoning a number of preferences which they already had, but it's worked out fabulously well for them. The Japan-Vietnam Economic Partnership Agreement, which was signed in 2009, is another fantastic example. Permanent normalized relations that can't be cut off immediately, but with continuous development assistance from the Japanese to Vietnam. Those are certainly models worth considering, although it would require sort of a willing partner on the African continent. And I think the third option, and this is something which we could actually start doing tomorrow if we chose, the African Union has expressed, I think, a fairly extraordinary amount of ambition in setting up the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, AfCFTA. They've expressed that they intend to turn this into a customs union not entirely dissimilar to what we see across Europe today. That would be a huge step forward. And as they attempt to get this through the WTO, eventually, I think that it would be good practice for the United Kingdom and for Julian Braithwaite, our ambassador there, to help them do that, because they're almost certainly going to get Article 24 problems from the Indians, amongst others. And it's not to say that this would all be without a certain amount of self-interest for UK PLC. Obviously, the more that we can consolidate and aggregate these markets across the African continent, where we know that we're going to see a huge demographic boom through 2050, the simpler it will be for British businesses to engage with those markets and with their consumers. And so, while I think it's good practice, if we're going to be spending £14 billion a year on foreign aid, to make sure that we're also expanding market opportunities at the same time to help lift additional people out of poverty, we shouldn't forget that there's a real self-interest here for the UK to engage a bit further.
Fantastic. Graham? Fernando, do you have a comment on that you'd like to bring in here on what's been said so far? Do you just want to listen to the Q&A, or?
You're still going to have another round here of Q&A.
Yeah, we're going to open up to the audience in just a moment. And Graham, if you run that, that'd be great. And I've got a question to kick off, but
Do you want to let her out?
Fernando,
I think I'm in charge now, James. So
exactly.
Let me listen to you a little bit more, and maybe I have something to say.
Okay.
I was absolutely fascinated by what you said, Fernando, and I really enjoyed it. I just have one issue with you. You said Smith argued that selfishness was the way. Actually, Smith didn't argue that selfishness was the way. He argued that self-interest was the key, and there is a very significant difference between self-interest and selfish. And I think that's one of the. And that's almost one of the big problems we face as a world at the moment. The strength of the anti-capitalist movement lies in they can, because so many people say this, that they can say it's all about selfishness, but we're more enlightened, we're more progressive. And as a result, we're going to create a new world in our new Jerusalem, which is not capitalist. But there's nothing new under the sun here. You can just go back centuries, and you've got a leading right back to the Greek philosophers. The promised land, the utopia, the nirvana was always the end of state ownership. And I think the huge threat now is that because capitalism is associated with things negative, even though it's really positive, because of that negativity, it means that we will, in the wake of the Great Recession, and we have already seen this real threat to openness in the future. And we have to find a way of articulating the message that actually capitalism is good, it's not bad, and it actually ultimately rests on a bedrock of freedom and openness, both domestically and internationally as well. And so I just think this stuff is so important. But it's not what the economists are studying at university. Economists don't study history of economic thought. They don't study the really much about institutional factors, let alone cultural factors, when it comes to the economy. Everything is downstream. The river's almost going out into the ocean at this point, and it's all about productivity and things. But it's just this vacuum that suddenly productivity performance starts down here. It doesn't ask what shapes the institutional factors which drive it, and what then shapes the institutional factors. You have to go further back. And actually, ultimately, I would just say that I think you have to go further back than even culture. Slightly controversial, but I actually think this is not a religious comment, the next one. I'll explain it. But ultimately, our attitudes towards capitalism are going to be shaped by our views on what I call creation, fall, and redemption. That's not, now, a Christian will have views on what creation is, what the fall is, and what redemption is. But you can see it played out in the secular world. Communism, the fall was a free market. The fall was private property, basically. And the redemption was in the end of private property and the public ownership. And so these things, right at a very high philosophical level, the way they interact with property rights and the way that shapes freedom is so important. But I've spoken for too long. My apologies.
The point I wanted to make about, which is the point you made, sir, which was about top-down and bottom-up. Of course, you need both things. There's no doubt about that. But then listening now to Graeme, the question is, in my part of the world, right, which is like 90% of the world's population. The way that you can understand the virtues of capitalism have to be the way they're living in down there. Okay, so they don't speak English, they haven't gone to university necessarily, they have their own issues. What I'm arguing is that it may be of interest to understand that as things have developed and the state of play is up until now, that the largest constituency, if we think of ourselves as a world population, are actually maybe the poor of the world. They're the ones that are most interested, first of all, in scale. It's not that they don't care. They're trying to migrate towards your countries like never before, desperately. And some people are setting up walls, some people are putting up less walls, but migration is a proof that they have pretty much it's very clear to them where they have to go. Now, if you ask them, why are you going there? They're not going to go from Adam Smith down. They're going to come from the bottom up. And the bottom up is a little bit like what I was talking about Mohammed Bouazizi, which he says, look, my country has approved all the agreements. We're part of the World Trade Organization. We're part of the IMF. We're part of it. But what does it mean to me? Yeah. All right? And we don't have the institutions with which to talk about that with them. We go back to what you were mentioning, Madam, about the World Trade Organization. It goes to tariff, non-tariff barriers, border tax adjustments, and AINMA, right? So there is, I think, space, if we want to globalize, for creating other institutions that pick up, if there's at all space for that, all the things we were talking about. You were talking about Frankfurt and everything of the kind. So, for example, now I am in conversations, hopefully, that it'll end well, which is technology, which is one of the things you were talking about, which I found very interesting, which is, no, you were talking about that how to get technology kicks in before, what was the second?
Population
Population growth. I think it's very important. So the reason we're talking now with, for example, Google Maps, is because Google Maps are talking with Lars Rasmussen about how to bring our stuff together, because Google Maps tell you where every city, where every river, where every forest is, but they don't tell you who actually has a sovereign right over there, a real sovereign right, and who has a property right. So maps without addresses, maps without knowing who has a right to what don't mean much. Next thing I wanted to know is, how do you communicate with these people? You were talking about the issue of communications, for example. So my fiance here is heavy on Facebook, and I really don't like it. There's a moment where, finding out whose poodle belongs to who else and whether dyed it pink is just a limit. However, all of a sudden I start finding out that in Peru, my country, of the 30 million people we are, 20 million have Facebook accounts. And while before, as I showed you, I communicate roughly with 10,000 miners at the same time, I started trying the communication first time through Facebook, and I got 2.5 billion. So that's another thing where technology is going to come around, because these people who in some cases don't write well, like somebody said, I didn't realize I was speaking prose. These people write with their thumbs, and they get right to the point. So Facebook becomes very interesting in terms of dealing with the future. And blockchain is a system which could be effectively a cryptocurrency a Ponzi scheme. We don't know, but that it is an accountability scheme is of course extremely interesting. So this question about top down, bottom up, all these things are important. But I think when I'm reading your report, James, they've got all the issues in place. It's very good because they have addressed them. The question is, how can you get that? All the information we're talking about Frankfurt, all the information we're talking about demography, all the information we're talking about, it's really they're handing it Facebook when it isn't even in statistics. And I think a crucial point to take there is that all the wars you're fighting, all your future markets in Africa, are among 5 billion people without addresses, and we don't know who they are and what they're accountable for and how much they can actually provide as guarantees, though they're sitting on top of lots of wealth. So I think you're addressing all the right issues, just to say a couple of nice things.
Just while people, no volunteers yet, just to make one response there. I think it's really important, again, going back to these basic things which really don't appear normally on the economic menu. And that is when you think about trust. The role of trust is absolutely fundamental. You know, you don't, when trust didn't extend beyond the little village and the hut, then you don't get an economy developing. You need to go from the simple to the complex. You know, Adam Smith's specialization, you know, division of labor driven by the extent of the market. And that foundational to that is trust. And I think relating to your point on technology there, Hernando, the huge thing out there is, in what way does blockchain accelerate the process of trust build-up at a global level? How does that work? Do people trust that? Does the trust in the technology lead to a far greater trust and openness, which then leads to far greater trade? Or, because if it does, then this world is going to become one world economy much quicker than we actually think. Of course, subject to the caveat that the President of the United States might veto that, but notwithstanding that.
Graeme, do I just
Yeah.
just comment on that? I think the combination of blockchain and mobile telephony is a real key here, because your point about you don't know who these millions of people are and what rights they have and so on, because they're kind of anonymous. Well, if you can combine a blockchain registry with a system which allows anyone with a mobile telephone, and we know now almost everyone seems to have one of those, to verify the credentials with that, through that, and of course it has to become trusted. So there's a question of who's owning it and who's running it. But assuming you can do that, then there's an almost exponential growth potential for that kind of trust to get into the system, so that you're not just trusting within your own village in Africa, you're not just trusting within your developed world network, but you can bridge the two.
Yeah.
If I may add to that, just a little comment, James. When I showed you those images of our work in North Africa and the Maghreb, in Tunisia, there was one picture which were all the documents that gave, shall we call it, rights. To give it a big, generous term. I mean, when in common law you talk about right, it's something that's ingrained. But all the paper that was there, all the paper that Mohammed Bouazizi had was local. What he wanted was the general kind of paper and recognition, like my passport, that allows you to cross borders. But local paper, he did have. The West won the war, 1989, against economic communism. People have followed. What I want to say is that in the places that I've worked in Africa, I've got a whole collection of West African property titles, or of Kenyan property titles. They are organized, and they are organized on a very local basis, because it's the left hand of Adam Smith that's gone out to help micro-enterprise get their records straight, etc. But they're not plugged into the global system. And the question there is, therefore, the strategy which we were mentioning before. Do we go top down and tell them, now look, this is the way our capital markets are organized. Do come in, comply with the law. Wait a second, the law is run by local chiefs, it's run by local oligarchs, etc. Or do you go around and teach it to them from the bottom up, which they will understand it because they have land. I mean, unless you're Dutch, it's the only thing that doesn't move. They have got, it's a reference point, and they've all got those reference points. They did the first maps and they've got them. We've got to find a way of sort of like bring the whole thing in. And the only reason I'm particularly interested in property rights is if you go back to British economist, right, Williamson, who talked about the Washington Consensus, he said these are the things for the West to succeed. The only thing we don't have is a World International Property Organization. There is no way where it's all brought together. That's why I think bottom-up is a very important thing. And technology, what you're talking about, the blockchain, the Facebooks of this world, do allow us to get in there, and what's funny enough, though it's high technology, in a way that people understand much more than going to a court and seeing a judge. Right.
Sir.
Just make two points. I'd be interested to hear what the panel thinks. First is technology, the blockchain. If we leave the ICOs and Bitcoin to one side and just look at what smart contracts might do to global trade, can the panel just comment on, let's say, for example, in a utopian world we increase the percentage of trade which is done on the basis of smart contracts. Is the world ready for that increase in momentum? When contracts settle immediately and people are paid much quicker. So that's the first point. The second point is we're talking about the US and sort of Trumpian utopia, dystopia, whatever your perspective is. But aren't the other elements in this equation, the sort of trade deficit, and also the 11 carrier groups, the role of global policemen, and this massive defence capability, which is, for all intents and purposes, actually kept the world in a much safer position. So I'd be interested to hear Graeme and Ando, your colleagues, what you think of those two points.
Could I ask maybe David to come in, given his blockchain link there? Question one.
Yes, it's a very good question, and it makes me think immediately of the kind of responsibility of those in tech to think about the broader implications of what they're doing, because here we are, we're saying, here we have this wonderful technology which will increase trust and it will make your transaction or your identity easier to verify and your transactions easier to verify and confirm, and isn't that great and don't you want it? And then you're quite reasonably raising a question, can we cope with the speed of transactions? I think it's a very good point. I'm just a chap thinking about the tech, I'm not the economist, but I think everything we've heard today rather suggests that there are plenty of other bits of grit within the system which can slow down transactions if you want them to be slowed down. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to happen instantaneously. And equally, would you want to, perhaps you would want to abolish email because it means we all have to respond to a whole lot of nonsense far too quickly, but we're not really going to abolish it, are we? So my sense is that ways of improving trust within our economy, whether it's on the micro scale or the macro scale, is a good thing. If that then has consequences that sorts of transactions don't have, can happen that much more quickly, well, there may well be some undesirable consequences for that, but I suspect we can manage them.
Ollie?
I have nothing on blockchain, but second question. So I'll leave blockchain to wiser heads. But as for your second question on the president, you're entirely right. The carrier groups are still in the water. The US military is still out there doing its job, and I don't think much has changed in that regard. My supposition about this presidency has always been that Mr. Trump would be more dangerous when it came to trade policy than military policy, because there's simply so little left in the form of checks and balances. Congress has ceded a huge amount of power to the executive over the last 30 to 40 years simply because it doesn't want to be responsible for trade policy, because it understands how controversial these agreements can end up being. So unfortunately, I can't be much of a ray of sunshine here. There's very little to stop the president's worst impulses when it comes to protectionism, other than those briefing notes, which he apparently doesn't read.
I think I'll answer the second question as well, because I'm not. Technology is a big part of the book, but I still haven't completely got my head around blockchain, so I'll make myself look foolish if I try and comment on it. But on the second issue, I guess we're talking about the relationship between hard and soft power here. Hard power being obviously the military and to some extent your economic weight. So those are the two big factors. Clearly, US is spending more as a proportion of GDP than any other, and when you've already got the world's biggest military and you're still spending more than everybody else on it, you may have very expensive pieces of kit like an F-35, but they've still got a huge throwaway there in terms of that and that I can't see going away. What actually, but it depends on the guy in the Oval Office. You could have the greatest military in the world in Britain, but if Mr. Corbyn was Prime Minister, then the throwaway would be somewhat more limited. And so I think that hard power doesn't really go away. Also, in an economic context, clearly China at purchasing power parity rates is the world's largest economy now, but it's still not by some way at market exchange rates. And given their working age population decline between now and 2050, they're probably going to lose about 400 million people from their working age population. And given the extent of the problems in their financial system, which are yet to rear their ugly head, then there's no guarantee that China will ultimately become the world's #1 economy either. The US could reign there, although the US has got its own huge problems because its unfunded liabilities, Medicare, Medicaid. So there are big hard power questions. But I think actually in the context of now and today and what we're talking about, it's the soft power which is the most important thing. It's been associated with the ideas. That's why there's a tragedy in the wake of Brexit, because what we could be doing as a nation is going out there, arguing for unilateral free trade, arguing for zero tariff and non-tariff barriers on imports, and making the case to the world for free trade. Be a champion there, lead the world in terms of soft power. The UK could do that. The UK vies with the US in terms of soft power. There's the Portland Global Soft Power Index, and it kind of says that because of our institutions, the monarchy, the country, our history, we have a huge influence in terms of our culture. And I think in the context of today, what the most important thing would be is actually to be seen as championing unilateral free trade, something that even when we kind of played with it in the 19th century, we never really did. We did it for all sorts of reasons, but it probably wasn't out of the higher motives. It'd be great if we could do it out of the higher motives as well. Selfless economic policies lead to greater prosperity. Sir.
I don't know if anyone saw Steve Bannon being interviewed by Zanny Minton Beddoes, the editor of The Economist. But it was a sort of ideological clash from like an extreme liberal position versus the Trumpite position. But I was very struck by him saying that, going on and on about you've got to think about your fellow citizens. How does the panel think you reconcile the demands of citizenship with free trade and commerce? I think not just in developed nations, where, you know, I guess you could argue people have had hollowing out of industries or whatever, but also between citizens of developing nations and citizens of developed nations, because there's a colonial legacy there which often you don't notice if you're sitting in London.
Yeah, I think there's a really important point there, which certainly gets missed in a lot of the debates about are we open or closed, are we liberal or are we not liberal, are we globalized, are we nationalist or whatever. And I'm kind of just reminded about that old slogan, wasn't it the Greens, the ecologists, about think global, act local. And I think you'd be a fool to think that the world can successfully deglobalize or should deglobalize. All the technological and other trends suggest absolutely the opposite. But people are still people, and you can't move people at the same speed as you move digital technology. And people still want, because they're humans, to have allegiances and allegiance to place, allegiance to family, allegiance to nation, allegiance to all sorts of other things. So we actually have to think in terms of if we're going to be in and benefit from and develop a globalized system, how do we retain or reintroduce, perhaps where we've lost it, a sense of local accountability based on relationships and allegiances, and simply to turn to people and say, well, it's a globalized world, so suck it up, it gets you the response that you allude to. So it seems to me we've actually got to work rather harder on that. As an example, the debate currently about migration and labour mobility in this country is quite acute. It may well be that a way through this is not to restrict migration as much as to make it clear that there is an accountability for the decisions that are taken. So when we say this is what we need to do, it is a we that can be voted out. It's a we that is accountable, rather than it's a we telling you you have no choice because this is how life is going to be. So the sense of thinking global and acting local is perhaps a path to think about as a not a third way, a halfway between the two extremes, if you like, but a way of managing them.
Yeah, of course.
I can only speak to the only country of which I am a citizen, which is the United States, and we have a rather different way of thinking about all of this, I think because of how the country was founded, and that save for a very small proportion of the population, we are all from somewhere else, and for the most part, we came to the United States. My family certainly came fleeing that which was unpleasant. You know, there are others who arrived in later years looking simply for opportunity. But I remain cautiously optimistic that that's sufficiently well baked into our national DNA that it isn't lost forever. And while Mr. Bannon and I would obviously have some disagreements about what it is to be a good citizen and to be kind to your fellow citizens, I think that in as much in our advanced economies, we can create a sense of pride that is who we are, that we are welcoming of others, not simply because it is the right thing to do, but because it is, you know, very much in our self-interest to do so. It might help to ease the transition in addition to the, you know, transition adjustment packages that Congress so generously passes every time we sign up to another one of these trade deals. So there's the economic, you know, providing retraining and subsidies where we can for those who are negatively impacted, but also the cultural, which is so much harder to legislate on, and in a way it's just something in the bloodstream. I think that it's actually it's a much more difficult conversation in the developing world, because when you do have huge numbers of people fleeing their homes with very little to go back to, I think that I have no answers. But yes, I think in a lot of ways that is the much more interesting question. How do you create a sense of national pride when people no longer want to be at home or feel that they can't be?
Thank you, Molly. It's a big question. I mean, I'd go back to some of my points before, actually, about the kind of river of prosperity. I think we may be looking at this slightly back to front. I mean, there's a lot of coverage about what is the impact of globalization and all these big macro trends on kind of the individual and civil society. Whereas I would flick this round. I would say it's the other. It's the free institutions, the notion of freedom is born of a civil society. It is a civil society which creates the institutions which facilitate this openness. So we're going from upstream to downstream. Now, I'm not saying there's totally all in one direction. There were some undertows going back upstream as well. But primarily, the process is from civil society to freedom and institutions. And I think there's a deeper issue there with regard to the states, that it's probably saying something about the nature of civil society, that the civil society has changed. And so the generation which facilitate, or the generations over centuries, which facilitated freedom and openness, that civil society is not maybe as strong as it once was. And as a consequence, not just in the States, but in countries like the UK as well, we get greater demands for interventionism and less openness. And actually, at root, it's born of problems within the civil society. It's not really born of economics. It's just a manifestation of that played out. Well, I think we've got one question now.
Picking up your point about the UK being sort of champion of free trade and sort of removing tariffs and so on, could I ask the panel about sort of standards? Because I mean, tariffs really are relatively low. They're not the sort of key issue in my mind in the more open economy and more open trade globally. It's much more now about standards, environmental standards, safety standards, data protection standards, and so on. And how do you see that evolving? Because, you know, if you look at, say, data protection, you've got sort of three blocks. You've got the European approach with GDPR, you've got the US, which has got a much less sort of regulating approach, you've got China, which has no approach at all, except the state decides. How are these issues going to play out in the future, and how do they affect this issue of a more sort of creating a more global, open world economy?
Can I kick off with that one? Yeah. I think there's a number of things going on there. I mean, countries such as the US aren't quite as free and open as they once were. You look at the Heritage Foundation Index of Economic Freedom, the US is plummeted on that index because of more interventionism. You're right with regard to overall tariffs and the impact they have. The average, WTO favoured MFN is about 3%. But within that 3% figure, there's a lot of difference. David will know the EU protectionist wall means there's a 10% tariff on cars. You know, there's 30 to 40% tariff on dairy products. And so in certain sectors, that tariff effect is insignificant. And you can capture the effect of non-tariff barriers in the differential between UK and global world prices. And that suggests that there's a 10 to 20% differential. In other words, non-tariff barriers, regulatory barriers, do have a huge impact, but it's difficult to measure them directly. You have to get them via differences in prices, and they are significant. They are very big.
So I would agree with your basic supposition that tariffs are really no longer the problem, with a caveat that there we're really only talking about OECD countries. Tariffs, or the threat of tariffs, are still a very significant part of trade policy in the developing world. A country, for example, which graduates from the generalized system of preferences, in the absence of a secondary trade agreement to fall back on, it would see the tariff rate on cocoa slabs jump from 4.8%, not particularly significant, to 40% potentially overnight. These tariffs are not negligible, especially when we're talking about global supply chains and the ability to manufacture essentially anywhere, because transport costs are now so low. And this really goes back to the point I was attempting to make earlier. Tariffs trading from the global south to the global north, and also between countries in the global south, those barriers are actually still incredibly high, and I see a real potential for British leadership in bringing those down, so that we can foster those trading links with the understanding, as we were saying earlier, that ultimately this is about getting people out of poverty. This is capitalism is the best mechanism that we found thus far for getting large numbers of people out of poverty very rapidly, and trade is a critical element of that.
Can I just answer on the regulatory barrier issue? I mean, regulatory barriers may be about how people want to live their lives and the kind of protections they want. I mean, the economist may be a barrier to a society. They may be about the type of society they want to live in. And I wonder is there a sort of kind of, if you like, a tension between the kind of standards and safeguards people in a society want and what economists think was optimal for free trade?
Yeah, there's no doubt that you do need some regulatory, and there are some economic benefits from aspects of harmonisation, for example. The question is, the overall direction and overall magnitude, and I think that's where we're saying there is an issue.
I think the Canadians would certainly agree with you when it comes to French language programming. This has been one of their big sticking points, on every trade negotiation they've entered into for the last however many years, is that Montreal would cease to be Montreal if they didn't actually really spend quite a lot of time and money protecting that audiovisual sector, so that half the content is in French. So yes, of course, we're talking about culture as much as the free exchange of goods and ideas when we get into regulatory issues.
David?
Yes, just a couple of thoughts. I mean, on data, think also about India as another potential model. 1.2 billion Indians now have a unique personal identifier, which is biometrically located. And so India is thinking very hard at the moment about what kind of a data protection model it wants, and it's not convinced it wants the same as the US, certainly not as China, and probably not as the Europeans. That's a work in progress, but there may be a fourth factor there. I think as far as regulation is concerned, I think there's a real challenge. There's a number of different levels of regulation. If you take the automotive sector, for example, there are a couple of regulatory systems, and people are simply not going to produce a whole range of cars to a dozen different regulatory systems around the world. So whether one likes it or not, the business dynamic there is going to mean that if the UK wanted to have its own system, it could, but it would be completely pointless because nobody would want to make cars to a separate system. That won't necessarily apply across all sectors, and the crunch really comes not perhaps in the specifications for a car, but in all the labour and environmental and social and other regulation which grows up in different ways around the world, some of which you could argue is protecting ways of life, some of which you could argue is actually tied to the safety of a product or whatever, some of which is just pure protection. And then I guess we go back to sort of Graeme's bigger point, which is who is going to drive the debate as to where you draw the line. and I don't know if it's going to be the UK, but it would be good if someone would do that.
Thank you, David. I can see James's battleship turning its guns towards us now, so we'll scuttle the ship at this point. Thank you very much indeed.